So, after watching The Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes, while I fully enjoyed the story, I recognized something that was glaring, and I thought maybe someone else would also notice it. I noticed how Suzanne Collins used women in her story, specifically in regards to Coriolanus Snow. I started noticing a trend, how it was due to women that Coriolanus was able to rise up in the ranks of the capital, and at the same time, it's due to a woman that his downfall is brought. I also think it's very interesting that the significant male figures in Coriolanus Snow's life end up dying and are just somewhat side characters and pieces when it comes to this story. Let's start with the first influential woman in Coriolanus Snow's life, his mother. The sad thing is that we don't know much about her and her presence, but we do know from the remnants that she was somewhat a symbol of morality in Coriolanus Snow's life. Alongside his mother, he also has the grandmam, and you could say a third mother-like figure is none other than the evil Dr. Volumina Gaul. In a weird way, and I've created a tier for this to be able to explain this visually, I think these three women represent, or tend to represent, Coriolanus's psyche, or at least the phases of his psyche. But otherwise, women such as Tigris, Lucy Gray, and Katniss Everdeen represent the opposition to his psyche, and that is why they end up either being discarded or being a target by Snow at the end of their stories. But yes, back to his mother. Actually, what I found super intriguing when I first started reading the book is that Snow's mother actually does not get a name. She's in fact just known as Mrs. Snow. Also, Sejanus's mother, who actually plays a more significant role, doesn't also get a first name as well. She's just known as Mrs. Plinth. I don't know why that specifically is, and it's also quite a contrast because Snow's father, Crassus Zathnos Snow, gets a whole entire mention. But I digress. His mother seems to be a sort of ominous figure in his life. We don't know much about her or her presence. In fact, we know that she dies in childbirth and that Coriolanus was supposed to have a sister. We know that she carried a handbag, and because of that scented powder in her compact, she always smelled like roses. The grandmam herself said that Coriolanus had his father's pale blue eyes, but Coriolanus always secretly wished that he had his mother's eyes instead. So we do know that she presumably did not have blue eyes. But outside of that, what we also do know is that Mrs. Snow was considered to be the very definition of a lady, said by Straight Boat Plinth, and that she was always gracious to him despite his background from District 2. She was pretty, but could be vapid, according to Casca Highbottom, and she had convinced herself that Crassus Snow would give her the freedom and love and seem fated to be a child forever due to her youth. Mrs. Snow was also described as someone who was not really tough enough for this world and had a fondness of music. The thing is, I don't really like looking at the definition of women from the lens of men, because we truly do not know anything about her from these men besides their observations. But since it's all we have, let's go off of those observations. A lot of the times, Casca Highbottom calls Snow's mother vapid, or somewhat fickle, without that much substance. But at the same time, she was the definition of a lady and was kind enough to Mr. Strabo Plinth to at least not disparage him from being district, which means that in comparison to the most of the capital, Mrs. Snow had the courtesy to at least be kind to someone who is deemed district, unlike the grandmam and everybody else who's from the capital, which is already a positive quality. Every time that Snow remembers his mother, he remembers her smell or her warmth or her fondness. But unfortunately, because of the fact that he was so young when she died, it seems that Snow's connection with anything to do with warmth, empathy, and kindness seems also equally vapid, which is arguably why it's one of the reasons he ends up being the way he is. Now, I'm not blaming it all on his mother, of course. His father plays a huge pivotal role in this as well, because he ends up having more of his characteristics, selfishness and the hunt for power. But we can also say that with the lens that is given to us, one can assume that Snow's mother's presence in his life wasn't one that was very long lasting. Unlike Sejanus's mother, not only is she alive, but also has seemed to instill some very strong values in him. But with Coriolanus, he didn't really have this opportunity with his mom. It seems that she was there, but somewhat a little bit meek in his life. And if you were to listen to what Highbottom said, that his mother believed that her husband, Crassus, would give her freedom and love, and that she was fated to be a child forever due to her youth. Perhaps, maybe, Snow's mother was not a very strong figure in his life. And you can see a relationship dynamic in which his father had more say in the relationship than she did. All of this is to say that with his relationship with his mother, and unfortunately the lack of her presence in his life, this would eventually set the precedent for his future relationships with women. Snow's symbolism also with his mother's belongings are also quite interesting. Her belongings are also the simple reminders that Snow still has empathy and connection with any empathetic part with himself. And as they get lost, or as he gives them away, or as they get confiscated, he loses more and more of his humanity, and also simultaneously more and more of the warmth and empathy that he remembers of his mother. And so his mother represents the first part of his psyche. Any sort of warmth, embrace, kindness, empathy, and anything that is associated with the stereotype of mother, anything that is somewhat good left in Snow. Because this part of his psyche isn't necessarily strong, it's easy to see why the remainder two parts of his psyche takes over. Now, I'm not a registered psychologist, so please do not take my word for an actual diagnosis on his actual mental health, but this is just conclusions that I come to from reading the book. But the second figure I wanted to talk about that is somewhat mother-like is the grandmam. The grandmam, unlike Snow's mother, however, she is not a soft, warm blanket. She is more proper, prim, and definitely belongs to a certain type of generation that just did things in a prim and proper way. It seems that her only sort of job within the books is to remind Snow of the Snow name and their position in Panem and her loyalty to the capital. She doesn't really do anything else, to be honest, which is quite surprising from a grandmother. Grandmothers normally impart wisdom and give sound advice, but it seems that perhaps the grandmam is just a little too old or might be losing some of her memory. What the grandmam normally does is that she wakes up every single morning and she sings the song The Gem of Panem as if that's the only thing she has left. That grounds her as a person, not her personality or her wisdom or anything she's learned from her family, but just Panem. Many a times in the book, whenever Coriolanus has a significant moment with Lucy Gray as well, while Tigris recognizes Lucy as a child like everyone else, the grandmam's voice is always in the background. She constantly does not fail to remind Coriolanus of the fact that they are capital and calls the children district, as if it's a sort of slur. And when Lucy Gray saves Coriolanus' life, she's still extremely dismissive of her, despite the fact that Lucy Gray is one of the reasons that her son actually survived. The grandmam also represents the voice of the general capital mentality, and this is why I say she represents the second part of his psyche, the part of himself that is always constantly attached to the capital and refuses to stop dehumanizing the districts. This is made worse by the fact that the grandmam every morning without fail sings the Gem of Panem, constantly reminding Coriolanus about who his family is. She shows more love and admiration to the capital and Panem than perhaps to her own grandchildren. This is not to say that she does not love them, but it seems that she's someone also quite absent in their lives, besides just being a figurehead for the Snow family. And she doesn't really impart that much wisdom into them, besides in reminding Coriolanus Snow how they are to be seen within the capital. And so that's why I say she represents this middle part of his psyche, this part of his psyche that wakes up every morning to remind him that he's a capital kid. The capital is important, the capital is right, the capital brings order, because it's what he's seen his own grandmother cling to every single morning of his life. And while Snow's thoughts might not interpret it that way, it can be presumed that a child unconsciously seeing this every single morning would cling on to the capital as his part of identity, which is arguably why it's so hard for Snow to let go of the capital when he finally meets Lucy Gray, and why it's hard for him to accept any other way of life. Because this way of life, clinging on to Panem and the capital and their status, is too ingrained in him. That, paired with his natural selfishness and inability to be able to be flexible, makes for a dangerous combination. But I'll get to that a little bit later. The third woman that forms a part of his psyche is the ever-famous Dr. Gaul. It can be argued that Dr. Gaul is the anti-mother figure, or the anti-Mrs. Snow in Coriolanus' life. As his memories of his birth mother fades away, they become replaced by that of Dr. Gaul. He ends up repeating Dr. Gaul's sentiment, and we have no more mention of his mother within his head. Dr. Gaul seemingly sees potential in Snow at the beginning, and she recognizes how his mind can be shaped. She actually doesn't do this with other capital children. In a lot of the mentor meetings, she does discuss things with them and give them assignments, but it's only with Coriolanus does she want to take it a step further. And when she recognizes this, she works her way into his mind more specifically, which is why I think it's one of the reasons she's so upset when Clemencia and Snow are put on the same project together, and Clemencia lies and says that she had done some of the work as well. In the movie, it's a completely different sentiment because Clemencia in the film actually claims she did all of it, but in the books, that originally didn't happen. Clemencia just wanted to be able to make sure that she did her project on time. And I think one of the reasons that Dr. Gaul, besides actually being a psychopath, punishes Clemencia for telling such a white lie is because perhaps she was insulted. Perhaps she was upset that her prodigy child, her innocent mind that she's trying to shape, would dare be eclipsed by somebody else who doesn't have half of the potential. That's the way I see things, but you guys can correct me on that one in the comments. One thing about Dr. Gaul is that she also represents a sort of weird/evil perversion and corruption of what is natural and what is good. Dr. Gaul actually started out as an obstetrician, bringing life into the world, but she wasn't happy and she never saw the joy of that job. She said parents always want reassurances you can't give about their children's future, which is inherently what she ends up doing in the games, corrupting and destroying children's futures. Dr. Gaul also represents death and mutation. From the beginning, Dr. Gaul has always been mutating animals to create a new birth of species that she wants. She perverts what is natural and what is naturally made to fit her own narrative and to fit whatever she feels like doing. She corrupts what is good naturally and turns it into her own creature of destruction that causes harm to others. In this way, she mutates Snow, who was not necessarily the most pure child ever, but she saw his potential and she took his partly corrupted and selfish mind and mutates him into becoming her own protege and continuing her legacy in Panem. Like I said earlier, she also represents death. Wherever she goes, whatever is good dies. Whatever she touches either becomes corrupted, mutated, or dies. It's one of the reasons why she finds it so easy to put children's lives in danger. Despite being a person who was previously responsible for bringing life into this world, she represents a carnal piece of Snow's mind that ends up taking over who he is. And unfortunately, unlike Sejanus, who has Ma, who is a very present mother figure, Snow is more susceptible to Dr. Gaul's sayings. I hate to put it this way, but naturally, if you came up in someone like Snow's family, you would have your fair share of mommy issues. And having an older woman specifically sort of take charge, which also instills fear in Snow, but also be a sort of guide and mentor, it would make sense why Snow is so easily capable of being warped by Dr. Gaul's sayings and teachings. Snow is the perfect candidate for Dr. Gaul's next experiment. I also think it's quite interesting that Snow's mother passed in childbirth, and he meets a woman who brought children into the world, but was also responsible for aiding in a system that took children violently out of the world as well, as birth itself is also quite a violent ordeal if you think about it. So that interesting juxtaposition of life, death, and birth, mutation, perversion, create this sort of weird haze around Dr. Gaul, which in a weird way is mysterious and enticing to Snow. Now again, this is not me trying to blame these three women for creating an eventual either psychopath or sociopath at this point. Again, I'm not a licensed psychologist. What I'm trying to say is that it's no secret that when you're a child, the people around you shape your vision of who you are. And if you already have the foundational blocks for being a selfish, entitled kid who doesn't see the point in necessarily helping others or putting others first, and these are the kind of people you have around you, it's no secret that you would end up being partly kind of a horrible person. These three women representing Snow's psyche at different phases, there's another tier of women who antagonize his psyche, like I said previously. Tigris, Lucy Gray, and eventually Katniss Everdeen. Tigris. It breaks my heart every time we talk about Tigris because of everything that she's been through, but I always felt that Tigris was the representation of everything that Snow could have been. If you look at it this way, Tigris was a capital kid as well, and she came from a prestigious Snow family, yet she's instead creative. She loves fashion and is not self-serving, unlike Coriolanus. She's kind and doesn't really discriminate. despite living all her life in the capital. One of the things I think is so powerful about Tigris is that, unfortunately, during the dark days, to be able to save her family and to be able to eat, in the books, it's alluded to that she had to sort of sell her body to be able to do so. And yet, despite this horror, while she was still a minor, she's still an open person. Constantly throughout the book, she reminds Coriolanus of what things must feel like for Lucy Gray. And despite the Grandmam's praise of the capital, she doesn't necessarily buy into it as much as Snow does. And yet, despite all her kind words, it feels like a lot of the times Tigris could never really get to Coriolanus. I think this is because she just wasn't as powerful to him. The reality is that Tigris is Snow's cousin. He sees her as family, just like how you would relate to your own cousins. But if you were to pale that in comparison to the power and prestige that Dr. Gaul has, you can see who would naturally win this argument and who would be a more polarizing figure. In a way, and in my personal opinion, I think Tigris represents kindness, humility, and understanding. 3 qualities that Snow inherently does not have. And that is why I say she's one of the women that represents things that antagonize his psyche. Now, this could be me reading into things too hard or projecting, but I noticed this sort of pattern in real life. In real life, there are people who are naturally kind and are caring for the people around them and are naturally more selfless. These people tend to be givers. People like Snow, however, who see relationships as transactional, tend to be takers. And I think Snow here is a taker. In my other video, and many times in this video, I've mentioned that Snow could possibly be within the dark triad of personality, either with psychopathy, sociopathy, or a narcissist. But if he exists in the dark triad of these personalities, a lot of the times these kinds of people see relationships as transactional, and they do not view people like the average person does. These types of people tend to view people in light of what they can use them for, not what they can provide for them. They see relationships as transactional and how it benefits them. A lot of the times, that is how Snow sees people in his head, especially in his POV in the books. And unfortunately, he ends up doing this with Tigris, even though she's family. Tigris is useful to him because she helps him be able to survive, but later in the series, and especially during the Hunger Games, Catching Fire, the Mockingjay, etc., she stops being useful to him and he discards her. Snow also does not reciprocate the 3 characteristics that Tigris shows: kindness, humility, and understanding. It's very hard for him to do so in his head in the books because it is not natural to him. He can partly understand them, but he can never fully emulate them without expecting something in return or without seeking power. And he does not see the importance of doing such things in the first place if it's not about control. This is not to say that Snow did not experience his fair share of trauma in the dark days, but at the end of the day, he was still lucky. He was protected by Tigris. And early in the books, Snow recognized that Tigris might have had to partake in sex work, and instead of being empathetic, being grateful that his sister had to do such things despite herself being a minor and having her childhood stripped away from her, how he might be able to ease her or try and help her or try and contribute. Instead, he thinks of how that reflects on him and the family name, already showing his roots for his selfishness and his self-centeredness. Another woman who antagonizes his psyche is Lucy Gray Baird. Lucy Gray Baird is also another representation of characteristics that Coriolanus Snow does not fully understand nor embrace: freedom, having a free spirit, creativity, and spontaneity. In her entrance in The Reaping, Snow becomes mesmerized and encapsulated by Lucy Gray. That is because she is something he simply cannot comprehend. She is wild, free, and full of spirit. She does whatever she wants whenever she wants, whereas Coriolanus is always seeking control and always has to be controlled. Lucy Gray does not do this, and in this way she's also a contrast to the whole entire capital. That's why her free spirit mesmerizes people. Snow immediately becomes attached to her. Not only is she something new and mesmerizing, but also because he has to be attached to her. She's also very useful to him. She is the way for him to be able to win the Hunger Games. That's one of the first things he recognizes when he sees her. And once he's done with that, well, you can see how easily their relationship deteriorates despite his infatuation for her. In my personal opinion, Coriolanus doesn't really ever really love Lucy Gray. Instead, he's obsessed with her. But true self-sacrificing love is something that I think he can truly never feel. Her philosophies on life and being free with Covey also antagonize everything that he's ever known. All his life, Coriolanus has known control, he's known order, and he feels safe with that, and he refuses to change or adapt because he's not an open person. You also see this glaring symbolism with the Mockingjay versus the Jabberjays. Coriolanus hates the Mockingjay because they're simply an abomination to him and they are not controlled, versus the Jabberjays, which are capital created, are controlled by the capital. Because Coriolanus does not understand the concept of true freedom and its entirety, he does not understand why the Mockingjay exists. Why does a creature from the capital mix with a mockingbird in the wild and create a Mockingjay? It's simply out of order for him in his head. This is all made worse when Lucy Gray and Snow have an argument about the Mockingjay. Lucy, who's a person who loves her freedom, thinks it's horrible that the Mockingjay have to be shot and killed, and Coriolanus doesn't see it that way, representing both of their psyches at this time and their way of thinking. Lucy Gray does not see them as capital or non-capital birds. She just sees them as animals and as beings that deserve their own freedom, but Coriolanus does not see it that way, and he refuses to change his point of view internally. That's what makes him 1,000 times worse. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if Lucy Gray had not run away. But knowing Coriolanus, after his rise to power, he probably would have found a way to discard Lucy Gray anyway, because she simply would not fit into the lifestyle that he wants in the capital. Eventually he would realize this, and eventually he would also realize he was truly not in love with her, and would still probably end up abandoning her because she simply would not serve his purpose anymore. And this leads into my final person that I wanted to mention, Katniss Everdeen. Now granted, Lucy Gray and Katniss are two completely different people. Lucy Gray is an entertainer. She is a vivacious person, whereas Katniss is a little bit more introverted and a little bit more awkward, but still they have amazing qualities as women. Katniss not only reminds him of Lucy Gray because of her district and the symbolism of the Mockingjay, which he already hated, but because she also mirrors some of the strong qualities. Katniss mirrors the two women in his life who cared about him and he ended up hurting. Tigris, who has kindness and humility, and Lucy Gray, who has a free spirit and creativity, and she cares about those that she loves. Katniss has a lot of these similar qualities. With her dark hair and district, she becomes a glaring red target for Snow. Katniss also went through dark times, but she was never self-serving. Just like Tigris, she was humble and kind, and even though she was awkward in her moments and had some moments which were not great, she was also a teenager and she did what she possibly could for her family, just like Lucy Gray does for her Covey. These are all qualities that Coriolanus does not really have, and he simply cannot fully be able to understand and feel, and anything that he cannot understand, he cannot control, and once he cannot control them, he wants to discard them. That mirrored with the Katniss root that Lucy Gray has, and the hanging tree song made Katniss an unfortunate target. I think it's simply poetic that it's the same characteristics that he took for granted and took advantage of in the women such as Tigris and Lucy Gray that ended up being his downfall. Not someone like him, not someone who is a cunning mastermind who is also seeking power, but a girl who is simply kinder and caring. Not someone who is an evil mastermind, but someone who gave other people hope. I also think that this whole series shows how vulnerable children are and how certain influences around us can shape us for the rest of our lives. Most importantly, if you refuse to recognize how these people shaped us, well, we end up continuing the same cycles of trauma, just like Snow did with his father. Anyways, this was just my unhinged analysis in the Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes. Tell me how you guys feel down below. Of course, I do feel limited in my analysis because I do not have any psychological training, but these are just my opinions and I hope you can able to discuss it in the comments below. I love to hear your guys' takes and alternatives. Anyways, thank you guys so much for watching and I'll see you guys later. Okay, bye!